Hello, welcome to the first Sunday of Lent 2017. The first reading this morning is from the book of Genesis, from chapters 2 and from chapters 3. It skips a lot of stuff, including the creation of women. That's why we suspect that perhaps men were the ones who chose this particular reading for this Sunday. But the reading begins. Then Yahweh God formed man out of the clay of the ground, and blew into his nostrils the breath of life. And so man became a living being. Then Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and placed there the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground Yahweh God made various trees grow, that were delightful to look at and good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now the serpent was the most cunning of all the animals that Yahweh God had made. The serpent asked the woman, "Did God really tell you not to eat from any of the trees in the garden?" The woman answered the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. It is only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, 'You shall not eat it or even touch it, lest you die.'" But the serpent said to the woman, "You certainly will not die. No, God knows well that the moment you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like gods, who know what is good and what is evil." The woman saw that the tree was good for food, pleasing to the eyes, and desirable for gaining wisdom. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were open. They realized that they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Word of the Lord. The second reading is from that famous section of chapter 5 of Paul's letter to the Romans, the one that speaks about how as one man sinned, one man gave us an example that went beyond sin, namely Jesus. Brothers and sisters, through one man sin entered the world, and through sin death. And thus death came to all men, inasmuch as all sinned. For up to the time of the law sin was in the world, though sin is not accounted when there is no law. But death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who did not sin, after the pattern of the trespass of Adam, who is the type of the one who was to come. But the gift is not like the transgression. For if by the transgression of the one the many died, how much more did the grace of God and the gracious gift of the one man, Jesus Christ, overflow for the many? And the gift is not like the result of the one who sinned. For after one sin there was the judgment that brought condemnation. But the gift, after many transgressions, brought acquittal. For if by the transgression of the one death came to reign through that one, how much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and of the gift of justification come to reign in life through the one Jesus Christ? In conclusion, just as through one transgression condemnation came upon all, so through one righteous act acquittal and life came to all. For just as through the disobedience of the one man the many were made sinners, so through the obedience of the one the many will be made righteous. The word of the Lord. The gospel is that famous scene in Matthew 4 of Jesus' temptation. Now, remember, when Matthew writes his gospel, he has a copy of Mark's gospel sitting in front of him. And at the beginning of Mark's gospel, Jesus was tempted also in the wilderness, but it doesn't say what the temptations consisted in. Luke also has these same temptations. Now remember, when there are the same stories in both Matthew and Luke, who supposedly never read one another's gospels, and these stories are not found in Mark, they have to come from a source that we don't have. And we refer to that source as the Q, the Quelle in German. Probably was a source that had an awful lot of sayings in Jesus in. And so Matthew uses this source because he will delineate all three temptations something Mark never did. At that time, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and afterward he was hungry. The tempter approached and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become loaves of bread." He said in reply, "It is written, one does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes forth from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and made him stand on the parapet of the temple. And he said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and with their hands they will support you, lest you dash your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "Again it is written, You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." Then the devil took him up to a very high mountain, and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their magnificence. And he said to him, "All these I shall give to you, if you will prostrate yourself and worship me." At this Jesus said to him, "Get away, Satan. It is written, Yahweh your God shall you worship, him alone shall you serve." Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and ministered to him. The Gospel of the Lord. It's very interesting because we Christians basically have a doctrine from this Genesis 3 passage that I just read, that Jews themselves do not get that doctrine out of there. That's the doctrine of original sin. And all of us learned, I learned in first grade already in Catholic school, that we have original sin on our soul when we're born. The only one who didn't have that was Jesus, of course, but also his mother Mary, who was freed from original sin. And that original sin basically came from the fact we're human beings. And our ancestors, in this case, in this myth in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve, committed this sin. They had original sin on their soul. And so when they had children, those children inherited that original sin. And that was the teaching I learned. That's the teaching most Catholics come up with. Practically all Christians believe the same thing, even though Jews don't necessarily believe that, even though they share our same scriptures. But there were problems with that particular explanation of original sin. And the problems really started when people began to understand that we didn't descend from just one set of parents. That in the evolutionary schema of things, there is a thing called polygenesis, which means basically there could be different sets of original parents at different places at different times, and all of us did not descend from just one set. And so toward the end of the 60s, Pope Paul VI called a conference in Rome of different experts to discuss this question of original sin. And if you have old critic magazines, pardon me, please. Obviously, my evolution of bronchitis is still around. If you have an old critic magazine from the late 60s, there's a detail of that particular meeting and the conclusion of those experts. You had scripture scholars, theologians, anthropologists, you had psychologists, and they were supposed to give Paul a way of looking at how original sin was passed down. Because it's possible one set of parents, if there were many sets of parents, might not have committed the original sin. So you might be 70% guilty of original sin when you were born. My set of parents might not have committed it. I might only have 20% of original sin on my soul. Kind of confusing if you follow that old myth about original sin came from just Adam and Eve, one set of parents. And so the major conclusion of this panel of experts was that original sin most probably wasn't something that our ancestors, no matter how many of them there were, actually committed. It was something that they didn't commit, something that they didn't do. When there were just a few human beings on earth, it was much easier for them to control the environment, at least moral environment, in which they lived. And they didn't do that. They really gave in to being sort of a dog-eat-dog world, something in which the environment automatically created problems for people. And so these experts among several of conclusions, but the one that I find most interesting, said, original sin is much more the environment into which all we human beings are born. And that environment is such an evil environment on many levels that it's only a matter of time before we commit our own original sin. That we do this, it isn't something that our ancestors did. Our ancestors helped create the environment. They might not have created the actual sin, but the environment is what each of us as human beings must face. And so when you look carefully at the readings, it seems that Jesus of Nazareth certainly attempted to change the environment in which he lived. He didn't just say, you got to do this, keep your nose clean, do good things, and then you get to heaven. They didn't crucify Jesus because of that particular theology. He was crucified because he wanted to change the entire environment in which people grew, or faced, or encountered, or simply were part of their lives. And when, pardon me, please. When you change environments, you're really up against it. We see that in the gospel especially because when the devil tempts Jesus, he tempts him to do the things that our environments say are really good things. Do the stupendous action, turn the stones into bread. Do something that'll get you in the papers. Jump from the parapet of the temple. You can use the publicity. It's always going to be good for you. Or just fall down and worship me, and I'll give you all these kingdoms. I'll give you all the civil power you would ever want. Jesus rejects that and says basically throughout the rest of Matthew's gospel that we live a life in which we don't give in to that environment. We really try to change it. Recently in our own country, I think we see what happens when the political environment changes. There was just a report the other day that I noticed where the difficulties with so many anti-Semitic actions, they were said to be given these actions due to many people living in a changed environment because of the recent political campaign for president. That especially one candidate created an environment where these crazies felt very much at home in doing what they did to their Jewish neighbors. We have to be careful that the environment is always something different, always something changed, always something where we can express what God wishes us to express. You know, in that first reading, when it spoke about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a knowledge there, as I said frequently in my homilies, even here, isn't just intellectually knowing something. Knowledge is actually experiencing something or someone or some situation in the Semitic terms. And so what Yahweh says about not eating from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he's basically saying, don't do anything that would cause you to experience evil. And as the text says, after the first parents ate from that tree, they were like the gods. They then knew what evil was like because they had just experienced it. And I always ask what the last verse of Genesis 2 is. Do you know it by memory, or we didn't have it in the reading today? The last verse is that the original couple were naked and they felt no shame. That was the author, the Yahwistic author, probably a woman according to many scholars. That was something that the Yahwistic author basically said is an outward sign that they were not disordered. They lived in an environment where they did not take advantage of one another sexually. That obviously changed in today's first reading because as soon as they sinned, the first thing they realized was they had no clothes on. And because they were vegetarians at that time, they had to make clothes of themselves from leaves, fig leaves or something. They couldn't use animal skins. But the point is that author is saying that since the fall took place, we have created an environment where it's very difficult not to sin. In other words, we should do something to somebody around us before they do it to us. It really is, as I said, a dog-eat-dog existence. And yet Paul in that Romans passage says, more or less, Jesus came and rectified the things that the first man, Adam, did. Adam created one type of an environment. Jesus created another type of environment. That's why even the most simple encounters we have with one another, if we can create a loving environment, instead of an environment where we always have to be the head high honcho or the chief or whatever it is, that Jesus would smile at us, the historical Jesus and the risen Jesus, and say, you're doing what I did. People aren't necessarily going to like you because of this, but you are doing it. When I was a child, we didn't stay at other people's houses very much, at least as kids. We'd visit, but not stay. But on those rare occasions when I spent a night at a friend's house, I often mused at how different that family treated stuff around them. That our family's way of doing it wasn't necessarily right or wrong, it was just different, that's all. And so I learned very young that there are different environments in which people can grow, or people can at least thrive or twiddle away. I think Jesus of Nazareth, as far as these experts were concerned, basically looked at what Adam and Eve did, even though it was a mythical way to explain the reality of the environment in which we live. And Jesus basically said, we don't have to live in that environment. We can change it. We can actually create an environment where people don't have to sin, an environment where they don't have to take advantage on other people, because we never take advantage of them. No matter where we live, no matter what we do, in the simplest of existence, we can help create environments that really eradicate original sin better than practically anything else in our life by just imitating Jesus of Nazareth. Thank you very much.